Before bringing Lazarus back to life, Jesus engaged in prayer. Yet what truly transpired in those sacred moments, the genuine technique, the internal transformation that came before the miraculous event, all of this has become forgotten in contemporary Christian practice. Not because anyone chose to conceal it on purpose, but because it demands something that most faith-based instruction has stopped passing down an actual technique. Have you ever experienced the feeling that your prayers simply bounce around in empty space as though you're calling out into an abyss with nobody on the other end? If so, you're certainly not the only one. The teaching you received said that prayer means having a conversation with God, making requests, begging and hoping He might respond if it aligns with His will, if the moment is appropriate, if your devotion measures up. And whenever nothing changes, the explanation you hear is that God declined your request, or perhaps your belief wasn't strong enough, or maybe His design simply surpasses your comprehension. But here's the truth that almost nobody shares with you. That approach bears no resemblance to what Jesus actually practiced when He prayed. When Jesus positioned Himself before the tomb where Lazarus lay, He didn't petition God to bring him back to life. He didn't beg or try to strike a deal. What happened instead, as John chapter 11 documents, was something truly remarkable. Jesus raised His gaze upward and declared, "Father, I give thanks that you have already heard me." Do you notice the verb tense He used, past tense? He expressed gratitude for something that hadn't yet manifested in physical reality, speaking as though the miracle had already reached completion before any visible proof existed. That doesn't fit the definition of a prayer that makes requests. That represents something entirely different. Look back through the gospel accounts and you'll discover this identical pattern appearing before each miraculous event. When Jesus brought healing to the paralyzed man in Mark chapter 2, the scripture tells us, He observed their faith and then gave the command. But in the space between observing and commanding, something took place that the gospel writer doesn't explicitly identify. When He multiplied food to feed 5,000 people, He first directed His gaze toward heaven, not to make a request, but to enter into alignment. When He traveled across the water's surface, Matthew chapter 14 describes how He climbed up the mountainside by Himself to pray before accomplishing what seemed impossible. Before restoring health to the woman who had suffered with bleeding for years, He sensed power moving outward from Him. He didn't make a conscious choice to heal her. He had already positioned Himself in a condition where power could transfer freely. There's an unmistakable sequence that repeats itself. He would remove Himself from the crowds, seek out isolation, undergo an interior transformation, and then power would manifest. The question that rarely gets asked is this: if Jesus provided straightforward instructions about the practice of prayer, why does contemporary Christianity approach it as though it's some kind of unsolvable puzzle instead of a teachable technique? In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus communicates something that most people misinterpret throughout their entire existence. He instructs, when you pray, enter into your room, shut the door behind you, and pray to your Father who exists in the hidden place. You've likely heard this passage explained as guidance about maintaining privacy. Go somewhere quiet. Don't make a display of yourself. Pray in a location where others can't observe you. And while that interpretation holds a certain surface-level accuracy, it completely overlooks what Jesus was genuinely communicating. The Greek term He selected for room is tameion. That word doesn't refer to a sleeping chamber or a storage closet. It describes an inner chamber, a treasury, a concealed space that exists within something else. Jesus isn't offering you suggestions about your physical surroundings. He's providing you with directions to an interior location. He's telling you that when you pray, you need to travel inward to the aspect of yourself that exists beyond your mental activity, beyond your sense of identity, beyond all the disturbance of your conscious awareness. Travel into your interior chamber, and then, and this detail carries critical importance, He says shut the door, not make an effort to concentrate, not reduce outside interference. Shut the door completely. Seal it shut. Block out the realm of physical sensation, the constant stream of mental conversation, the version of yourself that lives in fear and desire and constant asking, because the Father doesn't exist somewhere out there in the distance, listening from far away. The Father exists in secrecy within the interior chamber, in the location that most people never reach, because they don't even realize it's there to be found. And Jesus traveled to that very place every single time before power flowed through him. This isn't guesswork or speculation. It's a repeating pattern. Every act of healing, every miraculous occurrence, every moment when the invisible realm became visible, it followed this same sequence without exception. The inward journey came first, followed by alignment, then silence, and finally, power would manifest. But here's where the problem emerges. Nobody ever taught you the method for going inward. You were taught to shut your eyes and immediately begin speaking words, to think thoughts about God, to picture Him listening somewhere, to hold on to hope that He's giving you His attention. But thinking thoughts about God doesn't equal entering the location where God's presence actually dwells. And this distinction, this crucial difference, explains why the miracles came to a halt. Not because God stopped paying attention, but because the method, the actual step-by-step practice of entering the interior chamber and shutting the door slowly disappeared as Christianity transitioned from intimate contemplative gatherings to becoming the religion of vast empires. You can't turn silence into a system. You can't make interior development follow a standard formula. You can't equip religious leaders to guide people into a place when many of those leaders have never entered that space themselves. And so the written instruction remained preserved in the text, but the practice, the practical how-to, gradually faded away from common teaching. What survived were rituals. You could carry out prayers, you could commit to memory structures you could follow without ever needing to develop the interior capacity Jesus was pointing toward. The words remained intact, but the method vanished from memory. So let me explain to you what Jesus grasped and understood that's almost entirely missing from modern Christian instruction. Prayer isn't about trying to persuade God. It's about achieving coherence. Let me repeat that statement because this represents the pivotal turning point. Prayer, the kind Jesus actually practiced, isn't about convincing God to take some action. It's about entering a condition of alignment where you and the Source are no longer functioning as two separate beings. It's reaching the place where your will and the Father's will aren't in tension or negotiation with each other. They become identical, where no separation exists, no distance remains. No division creates a gap, only union. And from that unified place, when you speak words, you're not hoping that reality might change. You're acknowledging that it has already changed. That's the reason Jesus spoke using the past tense at the tomb of Lazarus. That's the reason he gave thanks to the Father before the miracle became visible. Because from inside the interior chamber, from the place of total alignment, the future and the present moment collapse together into one. What your physical eyes can observe hasn't caught up to reality yet. But in the realm where causes originate in the invisible dimension, the work is already complete. So you don't speak from a place of wanting something. You don't speak from a place of hoping something might happen. You don't speak from the anxious state of making requests. You speak from a place of agreement, from alignment, from the location where the Father's will and your will have stopped being divided. Listen carefully to how Jesus himself gave description to this in John chapter 14, verse 10. He stated, "The words that I speak to you, I don't speak from my own independent authority, but the Father who lives inside me accomplishes his works." He's not claiming the credit for himself. He's not declaring that he possesses personal power. He's explaining, I'm not the one doing this. The Father is doing it through my being. But take note of something crucial. He doesn't say the Father is doing it for him or to him. He says through him. Jesus became the channel, the passageway, the location where heaven and earth came together and met. And he accomplished that by entering the interior chamber and closing the door to absolutely everything that wasn't God. But this only works from that place. If you attempt to speak from your personality structure, from your ego identity, from your separated thinking mind, nothing manifests because you're not in alignment. You're still standing outside the door, still operating from the place that experiences lack and need. And the external world doesn't respond to separation. It responds to Source. And you only gain access to Source when you go to the place where Jesus went inward, behind the door, into the silence that exists before thought begins, before identity forms, before the noise of your own wanting starts up. This explains why he spent 40 days in the wilderness territory before his ministry work began. This explains why he climbed up the mountainside to pray before selecting the 12 disciples. This explains why he withdrew to isolated locations again and again, even when crowds were pressing in all around him, desperate to get his attention. He wasn't recharging his energy. He wasn't simply resting his body. He was realigning himself. He was returning to the interior chamber, shutting the door, and remembering who he truly was beyond the human personality structure. And every single time he completed this process, he returned carrying power. Now here's what I'm going to offer you. Not the complete method in its entirety, because the interior chamber only opens for those who are willing to remain at the threshold and wait, but I'll give you the entry point, the foundational practice that makes everything else become possible. If your desire is to go where Jesus went, you have to stop doing what you've been doing up until now. Stop talking to God inside your head. Stop making requests. Stop wanting things. Stop imagining him positioned somewhere out there, listening from a distance. Do this instead. Sit down somewhere that guarantees you won't face interruptions. Become still. Close your eyes. And instead of immediately starting to pray, instead of launching into words right away, simply breathe. Not special breathing techniques, not a complicated method. Just notice your breath as it moves. Feel it as it travels inward. Feel it as it travels outward. And with each exhale, you release consciously. Let go of one layer of mental noise. Let go of the thoughts about what tasks you need to complete later on. Let go of the conversation that happened earlier in the day. Let go of the version of yourself that's worried about tomorrow or mentally replaying yesterday's events. Just breathe. And as you continue doing this, begin to search for the place that exists behind your thoughts, the stillness that's always present underneath the mental chatter, the silence that lies beneath the noise. It's subtle and gentle. You won't hear an audible voice speaking. You won't see a vision appear. You won't have some kind of dramatic experience. But if you stay right there, if you resist the urge to start talking, to start asking, to start performing the prayer ritual you've been taught to follow, you'll begin to sense something, a presence not external to you, not separate from your being, but closer than your own breath, closer than your own heartbeat. That's the threshold of the interior chamber, and when you sense it, don't rush forward eagerly. Don't try to force something to happen. Don't start asking for things or mentally listing out your needs. Just exist there. Remain in that place. Even if it feels like nothing whatsoever is happening, even if your mind attempts to pull you back into thinking, into wanting, into the familiar pattern of asking God for things, remain still. Because the door doesn't open through force or effort. It opens through recognition. And recognition requires time to develop. You might sit there for 5 minutes and sense nothing at all. You might sit for 10 minutes and think you're doing it incorrectly, but you're not doing it wrong. You're learning the practice of being still. You're learning to shut the door completely. You're learning to stop talking for long enough to actually listen. You're learning what it feels like to stop being the voice that speaks inside your head, to stop being the one who lives in fear, to stop being the one who needs something fixed, provided for, or changed. You're learning to rest in the presence that's been there all along, waiting for you to notice it. And that's the foundation you must establish. Without this foundation in place, nothing else functions. You can learn every prayer technique that exists in the world. You can memorize scripture passages. You can fast, worship, and serve others, but if you never learn to enter the interior chamber, if you never learn to shut the door and become still, you'll always be praying from the outside. and the outside possesses no power. But here's what begins to change once you've established that foundational practice. Once you've learned to recognize the presence in the interior chamber. There's a second movement that Jesus made after the stillness, after the alignment, after entering the interior chamber and shutting the door. Not a spoken word, not a request. A shift in awareness that transformed alignment into authority. It's the difference between praying to the Father and praying as the Father. When Jesus declared, "The Father and I are one," he wasn't making a theological statement about his unique divine nature. He was describing the state he entered before every miracle took place. The place where the boundary separating self from source dissolved completely, where my will and thy will weren't two different things being negotiated against each other. They were the same movement. And from that place of union, he didn't ask for miracles to happen. He recognized them as already present. He saw what was already true in the invisible realm and spoke it into existence in the visible realm. That's the reason he could say to the paralytic, "Rise up and walk," with complete authority behind his words. That's the reason he could command the storm to become still. That's the reason he could call Lazarus out of the tomb. He wasn't hoping God would decide to act. He was acting from the place where he and God were unified as one. This is what happens when you learn to stay in the interior chamber. When you shut the door and rest in that presence for long enough, consistently enough, over time, something shifts inside you. You stop experiencing yourself as someone who exists separate from God asking for help to arrive. You start experiencing yourself as the place where God's will finds expression. Not because you're special in some way, not because you've achieved some elevated spiritual status above others, but because you've simply stopped standing in the way. The personality structure, the ego identity, the version of you that's constantly afraid and wanting and needing things, that's what blocks the flow of power. And when you enter the interior chamber and shut the door, you're temporarily setting that version of yourself to the side. You're stepping out of the way so that what's always been present there can move through you without obstruction. Jesus gave it the name the Kingdom of Heaven, not a place you travel to when you die. A state of consciousness you enter while you're still living and breathing. And he said, it's within you, inside, in the interior chamber. Now I want to be clear and direct about something. This isn't instantaneous. You won't try this once tonight and wake up tomorrow morning performing miracles. The interior chamber opens gradually over time. It requires practice, it requires patience, and it requires a willingness to sit in what appears to be nothingness while your nervous system learns to recognize a frequency it hasn't been accustomed to perceiving. But it does open. And when it does open, prayer stops being something you do to God and becomes something you do from God. Your words carry a different weight behind them. Your intentions align with a larger intelligence, and reality begins to respond differently because you're no longer operating from separation. You're operating from source. This is what the mystics knew and understood, what the Desert Fathers practiced daily, what contemplative Christians have been doing inside monasteries and hermitages for 2,000 years, while the broader church forgot how to teach it to regular people. But it was never meant to be locked away inside monasteries. It was meant for anyone willing to learn, anyone willing to stop talking for long enough to listen, anyone willing to enter the interior chamber and discover what's been waiting there all along, waiting for them. So here's what I'm asking you to do right now. Don't just watch this video and then move on to the next thing. Actually try it tonight, tomorrow morning, whenever you have 10 minutes of uninterrupted time available to you. Sit down, close your eyes, breathe steadily, let go of the noise. Feel for the stillness that exists behind your thoughts, and when you find it, when you touch that presence, even for a brief moment, stay right there. Don't ask for anything at all. Don't try to make anything happen. Just exist in that space. Learn what it feels like to be there. Train yourself to recognize it when it appears, because once you know how to find the interior chamber, once you've shut the door, even one single time, you can always return there. And the more times you return, the more natural it becomes until one day arrives when you realize you're not visiting anymore. You're living there permanently. That's when prayer stops being a practice you do and becomes your permanent state of being. That's when you understand what Jesus meant when he said, "The kingdom of heaven is at hand." Not coming someday in the future, not located somewhere else, right here, right now, within you. If this resonated with you, if something deep inside you recognized the truth of what we've explored here together, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who's been searching for a deeper way to pray, someone who needs to hear this. Leave a like if this gave you something valuable. Because the more people who discover the interior chamber, the more people who learn to shut the door and align with Source, the more this world undergoes transformation. Now go and be still and discover what's been waiting for you in the silence all this time.